Oh boy, where do I start? Well, before Confederation for sure, but how far back do we need to go here? Well, let's start with the early European exploration of Canada. For the most part, European settlement occurred in the Atlantic area and down the St. Lawrence River. Canada is blessed with many great resources, including fish, furs, and fir trees. But it's not blessed with a moderate climate, so many people coming to the area wanted to get the resources and get out. Many long-term settlements failed because the Europeans didn't know how to survive the cold climate and find resources to deal with things like scurvy, at least not until the Aboriginal peoples showed them how. Pine needle tea was a good remedy. Unfortunately, the important contributions of Aboriginal peoples to the settlement of Canada got left out of many textbooks until recently. At first, the relationship between First Nations groups and the European settlers was mostly peaceful, the extermination of the Beothuk being one very sad example of violent interactions. But as the number of European settlers grew, so did the competition for land. In the 13 colonies to the south, that competition became quite violent, with wars breaking out and biological warfare being used in the form of clothing and blankets, being contaminated with the smallpox, and then being traded with the First Nations, who did not have the same immunity to the disease, killing off entire communities. Here in Canada, we were more passive-aggressive. What do I mean? Well, as the prairies are being settled, the government approves the overhunting of the buffalo, in part to protect the land being cultivated for farms and to make money from the sale of the hides and bones, but also because of the First Nations' dependence on this resource. Once the buffalo were gone, the Prairie First Nations became more dependent on the government, and it was easy to coerce them into signing treaties. As the First Nations populations continued to decrease and competition for land and resources increased, the colonists took many steps to make the original peoples of Canada irrelevant. We'll talk more about the relationship between European settlers and First Nations groups in a future unit, but I do want to mention one symbol that I think beautifully represents that early relationship. The Goswenta, or two-row wampum, was an agreement between European settlers and the Iroquois Confederacy to coexist. It represents two vessels, the Haudenosaunee and the Europeans, traveling together in friendship and peace, but never touching, as they would agree to not interfere in the affairs of each other. They would not try to steer each other's vessels as they went down the river. That relationship as equals would ensure that they would respect each other. Some of the early explorers we list in our history books include Cartier and Champlain from France. The French had a stronger hold in the areas along the St. Lawrence River and also had powerful forts in the Atlantic region. Some British settlers moved further west to the area we now call Ontario, but most of the British went south to the 13 colonies. And the French and British fought over the Atlantic regions. After the control of Acadia went back and forth between the British and French, in 1755 the Acadians had had enough. They refused to pledge allegiance to the British, who happened to have control at the time. They were affirming their national identity as Acadians, not British or French. Well, the British couldn't have it and expelled 14,000 people from their homes and shipped them as far south as modern-day Georgia, which leads to the development of the Cajun peoples. Acadians' homes were burned, their lands were given to British settlers, and families were split up during the expulsion, and they became permanently separated. But this hardship also helped to strengthen the Acadian national identity, and today there are many Acadians who have returned to the Atlantic region and celebrate their national identity within the nation-state of Canada. During this time, the 7 Years' War is on between Britain and France. While some of the fighting in that war occurs in Europe, most of the fighting actually goes on in the North American colonies. In 1759, a smallish battle is fought on the Plains of Abraham, Quebec City, and the British gain control. The fighting stops for the winter because the pack ice on the river prevents transportation. What no one probably knew at the time was that the French would not get the supplies to the French-Canadian settlers in time the next spring to reinforce their troops, so that's it. The peace treaty gives essentially all of modern-day Canada to the British. The people of Quebec often refer to this as the conquest because they became a conquered people. And this is a big part of the discussion in this video, to help you see that there can be different perspectives on the same event. The rest of Canada sees this battle as a victory that moves British Canada forward, but the people of Quebec had a different outlook. After the war in 1763, the King of England writes a very important proclamation. This royal proclamation states that First Nations are a sovereign people and should be treated as such, that any interactions with them regarding things like the transfer of land had to be done by the governments, not just regular people, and that treaties would have to be signed, just like we do when we write an agreement with other nation states today. This is extremely important in the modern issues we have with land claims and Aboriginal self-government. We'll go into more detail on this in a later unit. The Royal Proclamation also limited the size of Quebec and banned Catholics from participating in government, which meant basically all of the French colonists, The British colonists were Protestant. But the 500 British colonists living in the area were outnumbered by 70,000 French settlers. So in 1774, the government passed the Quebec Act, which gave rights to the French settlers. They were promised that their language and their religion would be protected. One reason for giving the French these rights was obviously to prevent yet another war from breaking out. By telling the French that, yes, the government may be British, but your life won't change much because your culture is going to be legally protected, why would the French settlers want to rebel? Of course, the English settlers hated this because they felt that the French should be assimilated. Why give special rights to them? But the English were outnumbered. That is, until the settlers in the 13 colonies to the south got all feisty and waged a war of independence. What does the American War of Independence have to do with Canada? Well, when the war was over in 1783, a whole bunch of citizens who had supported the British had to move, and the British had promised anyone who had fought for them during the war could have some land in Canada. So over 40,000 English people moved to Canada, and the English now had enough of a population in Quebec to demand that the government change the rules in their favor. So the colony of Canada was then split into Upper and Lower Canada, with most of the Francophone settlers in Lower Canada. And for a time, there is stability, but the Canadian colonists don't have democracy while their neighbors to the south in the US do. In 1837, rebellions break out in both Upper and Lower Canada, and after the military ends the protests, the British government sends over Lord Durham to find out just what is making everybody so unhappy. He proposes that the British do need to reorganize the political system to allow for some democracy in their North American colonies. But what he's really remembered for by the French Canadians is that he also recommended that the French be assimilated. He felt that this idea of having two different nations within a nation state is one of the main problems in the Canadas and needs to end now. Stop and think how you would feel if your family had contributed to a community for centuries and you're now being told that you're a problem and must change the most fundamental aspects of your life, including language and religion. How would you feel? The government does take some of Lord Durham's recommendations into consideration, and in 1840, Canada is unified with the provinces of Canada East and Canada West, then created from Lower and Upper Canada. And a legislature is established that allows representatives to speak for the people. One problem, though, instead of representation by population, it's representation by region. So even though at this time the population of Canada East, which is mainly Francophone, is bigger than Canada West, which is mostly Anglophone, they both get the same voice. And even worse, the Governor General can and does override the laws being created in the legislature. So democracy is really not working, and the French Canadians, again, see that they're not being treated as equals. To fix these democratic problems, two politicians get together to demand responsible government. In 1848, Louis La Fontaine and Robert Baldwin, a Francophone and an Anglophone, were able to convince the British government that the governing power should be in the hands of the elected representatives, that power should be taken from the British governor and given to the Canadian citizens. This was an important step on our journey towards becoming a democratic nation-state. They also convinced the government to pass laws to protect the French language and culture. But by now, the Francophones are the minority and Anglophones are the dominant power in both politics and the economy. So while there were some protections for their language and religion, they were still being discriminated against and being treated like second-class citizens. Okay, we're going to stop there because Canada is about to become an independent nation state. But what I want you to think about is the different perspectives on the events leading up to this. Why would First Nations groups and Francophones see this history differently from other Canadians?